Dragon Age Veilguard is one of those games where your enjoyment really hinges on expectations. Whether you walk away satisfied or disappointed depends on what you're looking for going in. And lately I've noticed the phrase thrown around a lot, I really wanted to enjoy this, and then followed by a laundry list of unmet expectations and criticisms. But to me, if you say, I wanted to like this game, that means giving it a genuine shot, willing to appreciate it for what it is, not what it could have been. But these days, it feels like people use that line as a preemptive defense against any pushback saying, oh, you just didn't wait until it got good. And I just wanted to make that distinction up front because I went into Dragon Age Veilguard wanting to enjoy it, despite the tumultuous reviews and brutal criticism surrounding it. And so, what was my actual experience with Dragon Age Veilguard like? Well, it's kind of complicated. This review isn't coming from a vacuum, because I doubt many of you are experiencing it in one either. Most of you have probably already seen the debates and the social media uproar and the divided takes on Dragon Age Veilguard. And my goal here is to dig a bit deeper and unpack why this game has triggered such strong opinions, because there are a lot, and as a potential player, it's important to understand that the reality is nuanced. I want to contribute to the conversation in a way that helps people step back and consider their own expectations. I'm not here to fan the flames or pour water on them. I'm just here to sift through the noise and offer a balanced look for those who might be on the fence. So let's begin with the writing, which has taken quite a beating from critics, and for good reason. Is it great? No, not really. But it's not the absolute disaster that some snippets floating around make it out to be. If you're like me and you've watched a lot of shonen anime, then you've definitely seen worse. But a lot of the harshest takes seem to come from people who haven't played the game or are just basing their opinions on cherry-picked clips. And that seems a bit unfair. From someone with a background in narrative writing, I agree that 90% of it is just mediocre and often uninspired, but the problem isn't that the writing is always terrible, it's just that it rarely rises above average. The main issue is really that it's just boring writing. Honestly, I found myself often zoning out of quest, unsure of what exactly I was doing there. And that wasn't because they didn't tell me what was happening, they did, repeatedly, but because it only took noticing a sneeze mark on my monitor to steal my attention from the storytelling. And while there are moments where it almost shines through, those are few and far between. Veilguard makes the classic mistake of telling and not showing in a medium that has both visual and audio elements to lean on. And yet it spends way too much time spoon-feeding the player one plot-steamed vegetable at a time. The conversations are so on the nose that they lose any sense of subtlety or intrigue. Dialogue should always seek to multitask, like it can advance the plot, give character insights, and build the world, etc. And dialogue should aim to do at least two of these things at once, but here it often just feels like it does one blatant thing at a time. Though I will say, just for Veilguard, I am a fan of the pop-ups that tell you consequences of your dialogue choices, just because in a game where so much of the options feel inconsequential or one note, it is actually nice to know when a decision does create the slightest variance in narrative. A big example of this is Rook. You've probably heard that a lot of the dialogue choices for Rook don't make much of a difference, and tonally, that Rook always comes out sounding like the good guy, and that's completely true. And yeah, it's frustrating. But if you go in with the right expectations, it's at least doable. I knew about this, so I went into it accepting that the Rook I was going to be playing was a kind-natured, get-it-done protagonist, and that mindset did make a difference. It's not ideal, but it's much easier to accept and roll with. You've also probably heard Skill-Up's remark that it feels like HR is in the room, which is pretty accurate. Bioware games have always been progressive, and I appreciate the sentiment, but here it feels more rigid than fluid, like some lines were written by embittered people on X who think that any opinion shouted loud enough is irrefutable. And I'm all for tackling big topics, but when the writing is so obviously pushing an agenda first and telling a story second, it fails to do either. Although this doesn't go for all the writing, the parts that were like this I just rolled my eyes and moved on. Sure, they can break immersion, but I don't believe they ruin the experience if you let them. Now, if there's one standout in the narrative for me, it was the voice acting. The actors did what they could with the material they were given, and in some cases they really did lift the script. I played with one of the male Rook voice actors, I think it was Alex Jordan, and let me tell you, he was a highlight. He managed to pull some emotion and energy into otherwise dull scenes. And Rook ended up being my favourite character, and not because I was making his character, because I wasn't really, but because I enjoyed Jordan's delivery of the character. But again, the writing doesn't give the VAs much to work with, so even their efforts can only do so much. I also want to quickly mention, because I haven't really heard anyone else say it, that I was actually pleasantly surprised by how much Rook's backstory choice influences conversations. Having chosen the Grey Wardens as mine, I initially expected it to only be a minor detail, only popping up occasionally or affecting the outcome of a quest or two, but it definitely exceeded my expectations in terms of presence. And while yes, it often doesn't alter the outcome of quests, it does weave into dialogue options and even passive banter between Rook and the companions during field expeditions. It was actually a nice touch that did make me feel the world was a bit more laid and reactive to some of the individuality of my character. Now, coming to the combat, some people call it the best in the series, while others think it's boring and repetitive. Both opinions have some truth, I feel. At first glance, it looks pretty good. You ever watch gameplay of combat and think, oh, this looks pretty cool, and I bet there's a bunch more to it under the surface once I learn the systems and mechanics behind it. That's how I was going in, because the animations are smooth and the effects are flashy and it's easy to get wholly engaged with. But then once you do get into it, you realise that there's not that much depth to back up that initial impression. What you see is pretty much what you get. The combat never evolves beyond the surface spectacle that it is. And it is a spectacle sometimes. But don't get me wrong, the combat isn't bad, it's just competent. And for some, it'll be plenty enough. But if you're like me and you enjoy mechanics that push you to think on your feet, you might feel let down. The game throws you plenty of tools, parries, special attacks, combos, but it never really feels like it makes you use them. Functionally, there's nothing to stop you from going through every fight just rolling and smacking like some naked no-hit Dark Souls challenge. Veilguard gives you no real incentive to dig into the deeper combat systems because they just don't feel essential. Some enemies have barriers, and the game tells you the best types of attacks to break through them, but honestly, you can just spam basic attacks and still come out fine. The same goes for armor. Use strong attacks, and sure, they chip away at it faster, but none of it feels like it demands any real mental coordination or strategy. Using the specific tools that Veilguard points you towards doesn't come with that satisfying feeling of outsmarting the game or mastering some martial puzzle. It's not the kind of game where you get that light bulb moment where everything clicks and you feel rewarded for mastering it. Because personally, that's what I was hoping for and kind of expecting, because I'm a fan of combat that functions like a real-time puzzle where you need to use the right tools at the right moments to win. That's what keeps combat engaging and makes me feel like I'm doing more than just clicking buttons. But for me at least, that's the core issue with Veilguard's combat. It offers a buffet of options, but those options don't really feel unique roles. They feel more like variations of the same thing, different flavors of the same tool. To put it plainly, Veilguard's combat throws a lot of flashy moves your way, but when you strip it down, much of it just doesn't feel essential to the gameplay. Like you could take any single piece out and the combat wouldn't miss a beat. It'd still play the same way. Okay, so the caveat to all this is the context of the combat. All of what I just said wouldn't be as much of a problem if there was more to the enemies. Fighting fewer, tougher enemies that had more at their disposal I think would drastically change how the combat plays out. Because once you've fought the same enemy type several dozen times, which you will, you know exactly what to expect. Most of them only have 2 or 3 moves, not that it matters anyway, because every attack in the game is prefaced by a parry indicator telling you if it's blockable or not, so there's no real need to ever pay any attention to the enemies. The only real difference the enemies make is appearance, and maybe how much armor or barrier they have, but no foe requires a different strategy than any other. Also, on that note, I have to just say, maybe it's just me, but Veilguard has the most frustrating parry indication. It's constantly telling you an attack is coming, it's still coming, and it's still coming. Oh, you swung too soon, each. And usually there's multiple of these coming at once, and it doesn't well differentiate where they're coming from. Plus these cues can easily get drowned out in the chaos of 5 melee attacks and 3 spears coming at you at once. But this chaos can also be a boon to combat. On one hand, it does add some excitement. When you're on your toes trying to get on top of it all, it brings some thrill back into it. But on the other hand, it gets overwhelming to the point where precision goes out the window. With multiple enemies swinging and throwing projectiles relentlessly and simultaneously, you're bound to get hit, even if you're paying attention. And the combat never really reaches the point where you feel like you've mastered it and come out unscathed, even though there's barely anything to master. At least, all this is based on the harder difficulty that I played on. Which brings me to another important point. If you decide to play Veilguard, I'd recommend one of two approaches. If you don't care about or are bored by the combat, just go for the easiest difficulty and enjoy the story without stressing about the combat. Or you can also choose a harder difficulty where you're forced to use more of your arsenal. On hard, I found the game is balanced enough that encounters feel challenging but not impossible, which pushed me to try different tactics and really engage with what depth of the combat there is instead of questioning why bother with any of it if I don't need to survive. Which is also a strange credit to it. At no point did hard feel too hard or too easy, but that'll vary person to person of course. I should mention that I played as the warrior as well, so some of these things might be a bit different with other classes, but I think overall the issues are pretty universal with the whole combat system. Parallel to that, I also want to mention that I wasn't the biggest fan of the class system either. It really felt like it lacked the creative freedom to really build your own class and playstyle like Inquisition. I still remember having a lot of fun with Inquisition, experimenting until I ended up with a build that was a bit too OP and I could solo dragons. While Veilguard classes are unique from each other, their subclasses don't really feel like they leave much creativity in the player's hands to experiment with unique combinations and playstyles. Anyway, moving on. One thing that hasn't gotten enough attention, I feel, is the move from an open world format to a more linear structure. Now, don't get me wrong, linear games aren't inherently bad. In fact, Veilguard handles its linear design pretty well. The levels have enough side areas and optional paths to keep things interesting, and they're visually stunning. But Dragon Age has always thrived on exploration. It's the kind of game that I think needs to be open world. It needs to let the player breathe in their surroundings, explore and taste it at their leisure, to find hidden nooks, interesting diversions and side quests, to be fully enraptured by a zone and look at the distant, beautiful terrains and wonder how to get there and what might await them there. But in Veilguard, the world is beautiful and detailed, but the structure doesn't encourage that same sense of wonder. That doesn't mean that the areas and linear zones aren't fun. When they look as amazing and varied as they do, it's hard to not be blown away and immerse yourself in the world. But I just think it would have been far better if the world was still open to the player like the old entries to the series. Now, to be fair, there are things Veilguard does do well. As I mentioned, the visuals for one are stunning, and while many people have, understandably, criticised the art direction's failure to stay true to the Dragon Age vibe, I personally didn't care much. Sure, I probably would have preferred it if it held onto its roots, but it wasn't anything that really took me out of it. That said, it will for others. Yes, the Kunari, I know. I think the main reason I didn't care is because the environments are still genuinely jaw-dropping, and I'm a sucker for a stunning vista. Regardless of the kind of player you are, I'm sure you'll find yourself stopping to take in the scenery more than once. But visuals alone can't carry a game like this, and when so many of the other elements are just okay or average, there's nothing to distract you from the flaws. And this lack of a standout feature is probably why so many people come out of Veilguard feeling their disappointment is immeasurable and their day is ruined. Because it just doesn't have that one aspect that makes you go, wow, I can overlook everything else because this is amazing. The combat, the writing, the exploration, all of it's serviceable, but none of it is exceptional. And for a game with the Dragon Age legacy behind it, that's a tragedy that many will find impossible to overlook. But I also want to just consider another perspective for a second. If this exact same game had come out from a smaller indie studio, would we be as critical? I would guess probably not. Expectations are a big part of why people are reacting so strongly. When a big name studio like BioWare releases a game, we expect a certain level of quality, and when those expectations aren't met, it hits harder than if this were an ambitious project from a smaller team. And that brings me to one of the most important points that I've been reiterating. The expectations. So many players are coming into Veilguard with memories of past Dragon Age games, hoping to feel that same magic again. But you're just not going to find it here. And that can be a hard realization, especially if you've been a big fan for years. If you go in thinking you're going to get a game that rivals the best moments from Origins or Inquisition, you're setting yourself up for a disappointment. And yet, despite that I was aware of many of Veilguard's flaws beforehand, I went into it wanting to enjoy it, and there were moments where I genuinely did. But that said, the constant noise of other reviews and criticisms did creep into my head at times. There were moments where I found myself thinking, am I wrong for enjoying this? And that external context can mess with how you experience a game, so try to keep that in mind if you do decide to play. So anyway, after all that, do I think Dragon Age Veilguard is fun? Yeah, I do. Is it worth playing? Well, for some, yes, for others, no. If you're after the next big epic adventure in the Dragon Age series, and you know you won't enjoy anything less, probably don't play it. But if you're just after a fun adventure to dive into for a week or so, like I was, or you're a diehard fan who's willing to accept its flaws and just be in the world again, then yeah, it's fine. Is it worth full price? Maybe. I don't know, that's up to you. I don't think so, but if you're on the fence, it's probably better to wait for a sale. If you do really want to play it now, but you don't want to shell out full price, understandably, I would suggest getting EA Pro's membership for a month. It's far cheaper, and you'll likely finish the game in that time. And if you end up liking it enough to replay, it'll probably be on sale or be on Game Pass before you know it. And no, I'm not sponsored by EA, of course I'm not, look at my channel. So, overall, I'd say Dragon Age Veilguard is worth playing, just with tempered expectations. Think of it as a flashy blockbuster movie, something you enjoy in the moment and then don't think about much afterward. And I know that's a travesty to many Dragon Age fans, and it really is, but I'm just trying to unlock the perspective to acquire what dopamine you can from it, because there is a bit in there. Well, that'll be all from me. Let me know what you make of it down below, and I'm keen to know your thoughts, and if I could help anyone finally reach a decision either way. Anyway, thanks for watching and listening to me rant out my thoughts on a game that's already out of the spotlight. I am pretty new to this, but I do enjoy it, and I hope to do more reviews in the future, so if you enjoyed it or found it helpful, a like and a subscribe would really go a long way for me right now. Anyway, thanks again, and until later, catch ya.